Thank you everyone for coming to today's lunchtime lecture, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Julien Baley. Julien is from France and moved to the United Kingdom to do a master's in NLP at Edinburgh some time ago. And then in more recently has also done a master's in sinology at SOAS in London, where it happens to be that I was his dissertation supervisor. Although I don't know that that may just be because no one else was available. But anyhow, he did a very interesting very interesting MA, and this is the research that kind of comes off of that. And then I'll also mention that you may have seen his name on our homepage at the Trinity Center for Asian Studies, because he is also in his professional life an NLP engineer at Microsoft, and together, I mean, it's a kind of 90%, 99% him, but we are working together on making minority language auto-completion keyboards. So you may have seen him on our homepage in that context as well. But today it's about Chinese historical phonology, and in particular the use of networks as a tool for the study of rhymes. So with that, I will disappear from your view and let Julien do the talking.
Thanks, Nathan, for the intro. So I don't need to say more about myself. But yeah, as Nathan said, this is more or less a rework of my MA dissertation, and it's work in progress. There's an article currently under review. And yeah, so I'm going to hopefully make a brief introduction in the field of like a reconstruction of the Chinese phonology, and I will assume that the audience has enough knowledge about it that I can be brief in this domain. So Chinese characters do not explicitly indicate pronunciation. As we know, it's not an alphabetic or syllabic script. And so when we try to reconstruct all the stages of the language, we rely on two different types of information: explicit information and implicit information. So in the range of explicit information, we have a variety of tools at our disposal, in no particular order. Rhyme books, which are books that were written to help poets know which characters rhyme with each other, but without telling how they're pronounced, just saying A rhymes with B and with C, etc. Rhyme tables, which provide some explicit phonetic information regarding what the categories of rhyme books represent. Fancy spelling, which I work like a rebus. I don't know if you can see my pointer. If you cannot, please let me know, because I'll use it also later. But it tells us, hey, this character dong is pronounced as a sum of these two characters. So tok and hong, we take the first consonant of the first character and the rhyme of the second character, and it tells us that the character is pronounced dong. There's also some researchers who make use of loanwords from and to languages for which the script is phonetic. So if we know a word has been borrowed into another language and we know how that word is pronounced in that language, that gives us some information. And finally, last but not least, reflexes of these characters in modern dialects. And in the field of implicit information, we have the graphical structure of characters that tells us if this character contains this component, it's likely to be pronounced similarly to other characters that have this component. And finally, which is the topic of our investigation today, rhyme. If two things rhyme, then they are probably pronounced somewhat similarly. We are very thankful in Chinese studies to have a very wide range of rhyming material. starting like almost 3 millennia ago with bronze inscriptions, and of course the Book of Odes. And we have extremely large corpora of recorded poetry from the tongue and the song, hundreds of thousands of poems, and that represents millions of lines. And of course, with a lot of this material rhyming or supposedly rhyming, that gives us millions of examples of things that do rhyme together. There is currently no comprehensive annotation of this corpus due to its size. I do not believe that we can necessarily annotate it manually by a small team of people, at least. And so my research was aiming at finding how we can annotate this corpus. The goal of annotating this corpus is, of course, to provide an ensemble of material where we can, as a collective academic community, say, we know these things rhyme. What kind of analysis can we derive from it? So annotating this corpus and having collectively shared is a first step to the analysis. Of course, there have been plenty of people who did analysis themselves, but as far as I'm aware, they have not published a corpus on which they were relying. So this research is trying to address this. Brief bibliography as the main inspiration for this research was the last paper we see here, which is using network models to analyze all Chinese data by Johann Matthias List. And from the rest of the bibliography, you can see that I took a lot of inspiration from the work of Dr. List and a few others, including Nathan and of course Chris Foster, who described why we need to annotate, made tools to annotate manually, and here we're trying to address, let's do it automatically. So automatic annotation. I'd like to introduce some concepts. I think the easiest type of annotator is what I would call a set annotator. So what I mean by a set annotator is we take the list of all Chinese characters that exist, and we try to group them into rhyming sets. So if two characters belong to a set, they rhyme. It's a very simple concept. I have not seen it being named before, but it's easy to understand. As an annotator, if what you do is you go through a poem and you say, right, I've seen character A, which set does it belong to? And now I see character B, does it belong to the same set? Then it rhymes or it doesn't rhyme. So it's easy to understand, it's easy to inspect, and it's easy to visualize. The main problem with this kind of set annotators is they don't really take into account the context. So as I just explained, you say are A and B in the same set, but now if I see a poem which has let's say 16 characters that are in rhyming position and 15 of them rhyme, we can suspect that the last one would rhyme as well, but a set annotator has no knowledge of this. So there are natural examples of set annotators, or at least of material that we can use for set annotation. So rhyme books are the example of set annotator by excellence, because it groups all the characters that rhyme together. So if you take a rhyme book and you just take the time to encode it into sets, then you can automatically annotate an entire corpus. In this presentation, I rely a lot on the Guangyun rhyme book as a convenient and like often cited rhyme book for annotation. You could use reconstructions. So people who have taken the time to make reconstructions, you could use this reconstruction to say, well, these things rhyme, so I'm going to build a set with it. And of course, without going to the land of reconstruction, you could just take any manually annotated corpora and say, someone has already annotated this corpus and said that this character rhymes with that character, therefore I'm going to encode this knowledge into my annotator. Right? So going to taking inspiration from the paper that makes that takes rhyme networks and rhyme communities to build, well, to make some analysis of all Chinese rhymes, I decided to use this to make a set annotator. So I'm going to explain how to build a graph out of a list of Chinese poems, and then how we derive a set annotator from it. So here we have 3 poems. So they're all ranging more or less from like the 8th and 9th century. I don't have the date of the poems for any of the poems, but I just have the date of the authors. We can use it as an approximation. We assume that poets write poems when they're alive. And so here are the 3 poems, and I'll explain a bit the structure because we're going to use this kind of table all the time. So on the left column, we see the poem. In some of my tables, I will have 1 line per line, and in some others, for consent of space, I will have the 2 lines of a couplet on a single line. So the rhyme column shows like the last character, so the character that's in the rhyming position of each line, and MC stands for Middle Chinese, and that's the reconstructed pronunciation according to the Baxter and Sagar system. So that's where I quoted from. So here we can see we have a poem where every even numbered line has something that seems to rhyme, something like in and then u and u. And sometimes the first line of a quatrain also rhymes. And here I'm not sure if the ta is supposed to rhyme with e and ke. Maybe it's the intent of the poet, but it doesn't really matter whether it does or not here. And we get the same for the 2 other poems. So every even numbered line has something that seems to rhyme. So a, e, and the 3rd poem has like 3 rhymes. So a. And from these, we can build a graph. So if we go through the first poem and we take the character pronounced e and then the one pronounced ke, we make a node for each of these characters, and we draw a line to say they've occurred in a poem in which they're considered to rhyme. So the line between the nodes represent the concept of it rhymed in a poem. We do the same for the next 3 characters. So these 3 characters rhyme together, so ku, ku, and tu. And because they all rhyme with each other, we have the 3 nodes, and we make a line between each of them, right? We continue ke and hue. So we've already seen ke before. It's here. So when we add a node and a line between ke and hue, we do not link hue with e, because we have not seen a poem that shows them rhyming together. We just know that both of them in separate poems have rhymed with the same character, but that's it. And of course, the last poem has 3 characters that rhyme together, so we get this triangle. Right. So this is the basic concept. When things rhyme in a poem, we just link all of them together. When they rhyme but in different poems, there's no reason to link them together. So now we take this process, but we apply it to roughly 250,000 poems taken from the Quan Tang Shi, so the complete Shi poetry of the tongue, and same for the song. So you can see these are fairly sizable corpora, which I argue we don't really want to annotate by hand. And I make 2 simplifying assumptions. We could consider them perhaps even bad. We consider that everything that's on even numbered line within a poem rhymes. And we also consider that everything, if it's in a rhyming position in a given poem, it rhymes with each other. So it's a simplifying assumption. And if we go back to the previous poem, we can see it's even wrong. Because here, the assumption I make in this automated computation is that all these 4 characters rhyme. Here they don't. And it's the same here. We see that eke don't rhyme with ku, ku, tu. But we're going to see that the technique we use after on the total graph makes it an acceptable assumption. So we do this process on the 250,000 poems, and we get this huge illegible graph. In fact, there's a bit more in the southwest of this graph, but I thought I would make it slightly more legible by zooming on this area. And well, what can we say from it? If we look a bit closer to this graph, we can see, so the way this graph is printed is if characters often rhyme together in the entire corpus, they are attracted to each other. And if they don't rhyme often with each other, they are trying to push away from each other. So when we see a lot of characters that seem to detach themselves from the rest, but at the same time form a tightly knit community, this says these often rhyme in the corpus together. And if we just briefly look, we can see that there seem to be, I think a knowledge of Mandarin pronunciation is enough there. But you can see that characters, maybe in Mandarin are pronounced with reng, cheng, sheng, or ing, xing, or maybe even some yong. Well, everything that's in Middle Chinese is like ing or ong seem to often rhyme together. And we see the same thing with characters that are rhyming in u, so gu, u, some u as well, chu, etc. And we see the same with an, ang, and a group that seems to be ao, au. And so the principle of the rhyming community, so I will pass on the description of community detection, but the idea is that we look at a graph like this and we say, if characters are grouped together in a way where they have more links between each other than with outside of this group, then they form a community. So here, if we look at the ing ong group, they very often rhyme together, but less often with the rest of the corpus. And so that's the definition of a community. And if we go back to the concept of set annotator, what happens is we can say, well, if things are in a community, then that's a set. The community is the set. And so we can start annotating our poems by saying, these things did rhyme in the corpus, so we consider it a community. So now we can annotate the corpus. So I'm going to use a bit of color now so that we can see each color represents a community. Unfortunately, there's only a very finite number of colors. And so here the an and the ang are actually, let's say, two different blues, and they represent different community. And so we see the algorithm identified the fact that the ing, ong, and then the u, and then the ang and the an belong to different groups. And so you can use this color to say this is the set annotator. And by the way, if we go back to here, I had kind of identified au and eu as being a community because they seem to be detached nicely. But we see that the algorithm actually found them, although they are very close to each other, and therefore they are like close community. And that means that they often rhyme together, but not too often. So the algorithm says these are two different communities. One is the eu community and one is the au community. And I should probably note here that when I call them an, ang, ing, ong, etc., I'm relying on the knowledge that of existing reconstructions. Of course, if you were to come to do to investigate the corpus yourself at first, you would not know these reconstructions, and so you would have to come up with your own label. We do not a priori know that these communities correspond to a specific label. Right. So I hope this little introduction was clear enough, and hopefully I didn't take too much time. And we are going to look at a few case studies of like, once we have built an annotator like this, how does it behave? What can we do with it? Are there limitations? So the first case I have is a fairly trivial example. So we have a poem from the 11th century, and as a lot of shi poetry, what happens is there's a single rhyme the entire poem. So here I've added the Middle Chinese reconstruction for all of these characters, and we can see quack, black, mat, mat, tiak, etc. So all of these seem to rhyme because they end in ak. If we look at a rhyme book, the Guangyun, we see that all of these characters that are in the rhyme column are listed as rhyming in the Guangyun. So that's good. We have a kind of confirmation that it seems to work. Our system as annotated. So here, the type of annotation we see when it says A, it means the character after the annotation is part of a rhyme, and this rhyme is A. So the fact that all of them say A means all of them rhyme together. If we looked at the poems earlier, we would have had some A, and then some B, to mean these two characters rhyme together, and those two characters rhyme together, but the two different groups don't rhyme with each other. So that's a fairly trivial example, and of course, there's not much merit. Perhaps it may just be by chance that we said, well, everything rhymes, and it just happened to be so. So we can look. So we can see here. This is a little graph that shows. It takes all. It's a subset of this graph, but looking only at characters that ever came into contact with one of these characters. So any poem that has one of these characters, we look at what are the other characters that rhyme with it, and we end up with this graph. So we clearly see the ACT community being like disjoint from the rest. And so it seems to form a community of its own. And of course, there were a lot of poems where there were other characters, but that makes a undistinguishable mess. So anyway, to convince ourselves that the system is working and that I didn't just write a piece of code that says everything rhymes all the time, which, if you remember, was one of the simplifying assumptions we make when we train the model. Let's look at a poem where the rhyme changes every quatrain. So here we have on each line we have a couplet, so 2 lines actually, but trying to take less space. So 2 lines correspond to a quatrain, and if we look at the rhyming characters, we see that it seems to roughly rhyme every 2 lines together. So ip, on, en, in, ong, and then o, u. So of course, some of these may feel like they don't particularly rhyme, but that's I'm going to ignore this. It seems clear from the intent of the poet that it was meant to be A, B, C, D, E. So I take this just as an example to show that the community annotator is able to detect this kind of pattern. So even though at first we told during training, everything within a poem rhymes, the system is able to learn that in fact not everything in a poem rhymes. And here, when it's presented with a poem like this, it's able to say, here, not everything rhymes together. We have this pattern of A, B, C, D, E. And by the way, the other simplifying assumption was I'm only looking at even numbered lines. So these A, B, C, D, and E that we see here, as a way to make things simpler for myself, I've completely ignored them. And I think it doesn't really matter for the purpose of this talk. Right, so now we've seen that it works. And can we make more interesting things with it? Because here, well, yeah, let's see a more interesting case. So let's look at when another annotator disagrees with the community annotator. So for instance, we know that poets were incited to use the rhyme books to choose the characters to use in their poem for rhyme. But in practice, poets greatly diverge from this ideal of using the rhyme book. So here we have a poem in which the community annotator said everything rhymes together, but if we had looked into a rhyme book, it would say, well, actually, most of these things don't rhyme with each other. And if we look at this poem in particular, it would say there are 8 different rhymes that appear. So we have this kind of discrepancy between the very prescriptive rhyme book says this doesn't rhyme, and the fact that our community annotator said, based on the entire corpus, it looks like these things rhyme together. And if we take the characters that we see here and we look at the graph, the subgraph of what we've seen earlier, this is a graph. So sorry, the fact that it says a here means the community annotator considers that these characters in the second column all belong to the same set, or we can say in the same community. Now, if we plot this community, and here the colors represent which Guangyun rhyme it is, we can see that we have something that is very tightly knit. So, like if I remove all these colors and make them all blue, you would not notice that there are different groups, right? They are too closely stuck together. We can kind of see that there's a split between West and East on this, and this corresponds to a tone split. So even though all of these characters were largely used interchangeably as rhyming, we can still kind of see that we have the rising tone on the left and then the departing tone on the right. So of course it was common practice to have inter-rhyming between those groups, but it was not perfect. So this graph, it is the result. This shows the community on the entire tongue and song corpus. So we are spanning 600 years of poetry, and 80% of that poetry is from the song. Now, if we go back to when we said we're going to build an annotator for the entire tongue and song, and instead we say, let's build an annotator for just the tongue, what we see is a very different picture. So what happens is, with an annotator that is trained only on tongue poems, so earlier poems, it annotates the poem as having 5 different communities instead of just 1. And of course, we said the Guangyun considers there are 8 communities. And here we can see, as opposed to the previous graph, like these communities are fairly separate. Of course, there is some contact with them, like every gray little link shows inter-community rhymes, but overall, they're very distinct. So this could be an avenue for us to see, to track diachronic change in rhymes by saying, if we build an annotator, which is empirical, on an early corpus, and then we build another annotator on the later corpus, and we annotate a single poem, and they annotate the poem differently, then that must mean that perhaps there was a change in rhyming practice, and perhaps that change in rhyming practice is due to a change in phonology. So we'll come back to this a bit later, but let's go with the fourth case study, which maybe shows the limits of the community annotator. So here we have a very simple poem with 4 rhyming characters, and here I didn't go with Baxter and Sagar, but I've used the reconstruction by Edwin Pulley-Blank of late Middle Chinese. So here, of course, we have a poem that's 13th century, so it's actually far beyond the stage of late Middle Chinese, which would be, I think, in Pulley-Blank's view, something like 7th or 8th century. And this 13th century maybe corresponds more closely to early Mandarin. But for the purpose of illustration, this is fine to use LMC, because of course our corpus is more centered on the tongue and song, and here we are really at the end of the song. So we have 4 characters that, according to LMC, seem to rhyme fairly well. So huai, hiai, kiai, and pai, with a long vowel and an offset J glide. But our annotator considered that the tia character, or the kiai character, does not rhyme with the other. And if we look at the poem, of course, there seems to be very little doubt that the intent of the poem is to make this 3rd character rhyme with the rest. So why does the annotator disagree with it. So the intent is clear. And if we look at rhyme books, we can see that this character, the kiai, is listed as belonging to the so-called kiai rhyme. That is to say itself. It's just a coincidence here. Both in the Guangyun and in the Ministry of Rights rhyme book, which is a bit later, and it will become relevant a bit later. And so that's for the rhyme books. So it seems the poet took things from the rhyme book. And however, our community annotator says kiai, so this character actually rhymes with the me rhyme. So why is that? If we print a graph of just these two rhymes, so I've colored in blue the me rhyme and in orange the kiai rhyme, we can see that although they are fairly distinct, there's a lot of contact that seems to happen between the two in the middle. So some communities, although they are distinct, can be more or less close to each other. And if we look a bit closer to the interface of this graph, what we see is first that the kiai is very much in the boundary there. So it means it has a lot of contact with the kiai, with its own rhyme group, but it still sits quite nicely in the me rhyme. And if you have sharp enough eyes, you may notice that the characters at the interface between these two groups, they all have this kwe, the same phonetic component. So we see ya, I don't know this one, ya, wa, some wa as well, wa, tia, etc. And so it may be interesting to look at these, and of course it's interesting that they all share the same phonetic component. So if we look at these characters in a rhyme book like the Ministry of Rights, what we see is they are all listed as belonging to both rhymes. So it's kind of the aha moment. This explains kind of why we see these two communities being very close, is that the rhyme books themselves say that these a range of these characters that we saw there in the that we saw in the middle, they're actually listed in rhyme books as belonging to both groups. And if we look at Fully Blank's reconstruction of late Middle Chinese for these characters that most often rhyme with kiai, we see that a lot of them rhyme in a, and some of them rhyme in yai, or just I. But the majority of the characters that are found in the corpus as rhyming with kiai actually are in a, which suggests that this character kind of had already lost its J glide at the end. And of course, in modern Mandarin, it's tia, so the glide has disappeared. Right, so what can we conclude of this? From the poem, it's clear the intent of the poet is to say this rhymes. The poet is justified in that all of the rhyme books seem to agree that this character has a J glide and rhymes with the huai, hai, and bai that we've seen. But in practice, if we look at all of the poems of the tongue and the song, at least in the shi genre, we see that 78% of the time, it does not rhyme with characters that have this J glide, but it rhymes with characters that have this either a or a rhyme. And I found it interesting to note that these 78%, or at least a very large majority of it, was already the case in the tongue. So in fact, it was even worse during the tongue. There's only 9 occurrences of the character in rhyming position, but 8 out of these 9, it was not rhyming with a y at the end, but with a simple a. And geography does not seem to play a role either. So in modern Cantonese and modern Minnan, these characters, so the character tia still has a J glide, but if we look at all the poems of the tongue and the song, there doesn't seem to be a correlation between geography and the use of this character as a rhyme. So the annotator is wrong, clearly, about this poem because it should have annotated as AAA, but it seems that the poet's choice is a bit weird, or maybe we could say conservative. It kind of obeys the rhyme book, but nobody spoke like this anymore. And indeed, the character had already lost this J glide. So anyone who would have read the poem in the current pronunciation of the time would have found that it didn't really rhyme. So that's an interesting bit, I think, is that the annotator can be wrong because it didn't take into account context, but usually when it is wrong with a good reason. And maybe a human would also consider that these two things should not have been picked to rhyme. Right, so it says recap, but it's not the end. A little recap of what are the advantages of this community annotator. It works on non-annotated data. So if you remember, we started by taking the corpus and just assuming that everything rhymed. So we didn't need to go and annotate anything. We just said, we are going to assume everything rhyme at first and then get the community annotator to kind of disentangle all of these and decide what rhymes with what doesn't rhyme. As a result, it requires very little expert knowledge. And I think I'm a proof of this here. So I discovered a lot of things just by using the tool and exploring. It's empirical, so it means even if you didn't have any rhyme book, just by taking your corpus that you have at hand, you can train it to then make these kind of discoveries. I've worked on an accuracy metric for this, and I've annotated manually a few hundred poems of various types, and I found a 98% accuracy in the annotation. We'll see that there's a bit of caveat is that the genre of poetry is very easy to annotate because it has a tendency of having everything rhyming in a single poem, which is why my simplifying assumption earlier is actually okay for this type of poem. If we were working with something like or older poetry, it may be not a very good idea. And it makes it very easy to highlight odd poems. So these poems, out of a corpus of 250,000 of poems, being able to find this interesting example was very easy, and I didn't have to sift through hundreds and hundreds of poems or thousands. And of course, as we've seen in case study 4, the problem is that as a set annotator, it misses the intent sometimes. But at the same time, the fact that it missed the intent in the last case study kind of gave us some interesting discussion. Right, so earlier in case study 3, I mentioned that if we looked at an annotator trained on the tongue and an annotator trained on the song, we could see if the annotation was different for a given poem, it could mean that there was a phonological change, right? And we seem to have seen rhyme merge and rhyme split. So rhyme merge was in case 3, where we said something that used to be annotated as 5 rhymes in the tongue is now annotated as a single rhyme in the song. And we've seen a sort of split with the case study 4, where we say something that used to be rhyming actually became, well, should have been considered not rhyming anymore in the 13th century. So can we date these changes? And can we detect them automatically? And I propose a strategy for it, and it's to say, since we know in this corpus the date of birth and death of the poet, we can kind of assign a creation date to a poem by saying roughly mid-life of the poet. And now that we are able to say for each poem, that's when it was composed, we can have a sliding window where we say, I'm going to train an annotator every 50 years by taking the poems that are 50 years apart from that point. And so only these poems. So I train an annotator based on the poems composed between 600 and 700, an annotator between 650 and 750, and etc., etc. So as we move, we have annotators that are empirically specialized to a given period, to a given century. We can go more or less granular, you know, like the details here are up for debate, but a window that is 100-year wide and that moves by 50-year step seems to be doing okay. And if we go back to the poem of case 33, so this is what we had. This was with having an annotator for the tongue and an annotator for the song. And we said, okay, in one case, we have 5 communities, 1 color per community. And in the second case, we have 1 community where I've used a color to show all of the different rhymes according to the rhyme book. But if we colored by community, this would be a single color. So now we annotate this very poem with the sliding window annotator. And what we get is that what I'm plotting is how many rhymes are there in the poem based on an annotator in 650, 700, 750, etc. And what we see is that at the beginning of the tongue, this poem would have been considered to have 6 different rhymes. And so it would not have been a very good poem because the poem was composed here. And so it, with the intent from the poet that everything rhymes. But if someone from the tongue read this poem, it would have said, this doesn't rhyme at all. There are 6 different categories. Here, there seems to be a little glitch, which I cannot explain. And once we reach the interregnum between the tongue and the song, so roughly 10th century, we see that successive annotators consider less and less that these are different categories, and the number of distinct annotations fall to 1, which is what seems to be correct. That is to say, everything in that poem rhymes. And once we reach the end of the song, there's an interesting phenomenon where the number of rhyming categories seem to climb again to 3. And what this means is here we witness a merge. So we used to have the 6 categories, and then we have 1. So that's a succession of merges, of course. Exactly when each of them happened, we don't know, but and maybe that already happened in the common speech, but at least in poetry, there's a clear mark where we say from 900 onwards, and in a window that seems to span 130 years, all of these characters that were pronounced fairly differently now have the same rhyme. And what we see here, when the number increases again, is things that in the 12th century all rhymed, now they cease to rhyme. And so we can have a deep dive into why that might be the case. So that's a lot of information on this, but I show kind of the result of an annotator in 860, 1100, and 1300. So if we go back to here, that correspond to before the merge, after the merge, and after the final split. And what we can see if we look at the column that's called community 860 and the one that's called Guangyun annotator is that in the tongue, there was a very strong agreement between the community annotator trained on that period, trained on 9th century, and the Guangyun. So there are a few discrepancies, but overall we see AA, CC, AA, etc. So that means that the behavior for this rhyme, at least, of poets in the 9th century was still very close to the Guangyun. The fact that here pan as a B is because it only appears like 3 or 4 times in rhyming position. And so there was not enough data to retrain it properly. And so we have a misclassification. Once we move to 1100, we see that everything rhymes. And if we look at the late Middle Chinese reconstruction, by the way, late Middle Chinese may be a bit early for 1100, but anyway, we see that Pouilly-Blanc reconstructs all of them as having an A rhyme, which was not the case in early Middle Chinese, where we had some like A, Ya, etc. So this explains why we got a merge. We went from having 6 categories here. So if we count the different letters A, B, C, D, E, F, so that's 6. And in 1100, we only got 1 letter, which means everything rhymed in the poem. And finally, if we look at what happened in 1300, and for illustration, I showed an early Mandarin reconstruction by Pouilly-Blanc. We see that we have 3 letters now, A, B, and C, and that these correspond, of course, to different vowel, except for the pan again. I don't know what's going on with this one, but Pouilly-Blanc explains it as saying that characters for which there was a E or a U glide, so Guan, Yen, Mien, the A was fronted and became an E. So all of these that we see, I colored them in blue, and they all have a E. The one that have a U glide, so Juan and Juan, the A became even more back and became a O, which I've noted in red. And finally, the ones which had a long vowel, so Kian and here Hian, he argues that the length of the vowel prevented it from being fronted or backed. And so they remain with an A. And that's how we get this kind of what we see in this graph here, with first we go from 6, we fall at 1, and then we get back to having 3 different things. Of course, here I've discovered this poem and this interesting phenomenon, and then I try to figure out why. And thankfully, Edwin Pouilly-Blanc had already kind of explained this phenomenon, but it's interesting that I was able to discover this thing as well with much less specialist knowledge and less time as well. So that's how you can discover rhyme change. That's more or less the end of this presentation. It's still a work in progress. I have an article on the review for this. The annotation of the entire corpus as described has been published here with this DOI if you're interested in it. We have an annotation accuracy metric, and it seems to behave very well. So 98% accuracy on the full Tang and Song Shi poetry. And if we exclude the poems in which the pattern is fairly trivial, we get 84% accuracy, which is lower, of course, than 98, but it's much better than what you would get if you had an annotation done by a rhyme book. There's more work needed. Here, Shi poetry is rather easy because it tends to be a lot of so single rhyme per poem. But if you go to use a corpus like Ci, so for instance, there's a very big collection of Ci poetry from the Song, or if you go, of course, with earlier corpus than the Tang, it might be more difficult, and you might have to maybe bootstrap by annotating by hand a bit and then running the algorithm, etc. But I think the algorithm would provide a good speed up. And an area of particular interest for me is, of course, I've shown how we can highlight rhyme merges and rhyme splits, but can we automatically discover them to bring all of the poems that are relevant for analysis and refine our knowledge of Middle Chinese evolution into early Mandarin? And of course, this can be done synchronically. For these poems, we know where the authors were from. And so if we approximate their origin with their dialect, we could perhaps see some merges spreading from Northwest China to Southeast or these kind of things. Right, thanks. I'm happy to take any questions or even more suggestions for the work. And if you want to get in touch, you have my email address here.
Maybe you can put your presentation away, or I don't know what.
Yeah, I can.
I don't know. Yeah.
Maybe questions will be about a specific.
Oh yeah, yeah. So maybe it's good to leave out. Let me just say to everyone that I mean, I don't know. You can put things in the chat if you want, but also if you feel comfortable, you can just unmute yourself and show your face and say something. To get things started, I'll just ask a simple question, which is, you were saying that the Ci poems are more complicated, right? But it seems like actually then you've done things, let's say, precisely because the Shi poems are simpler, annotator trained on the Si poems is likely to do very well on the, an annotator trained on Shi poems is likely to do a very good job on Si poems.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
It's supposed to work by period, I would say. So
yeah.
We could use this Shi-trained annotator to annotate the Tzu corpus. That is true. But out of this case, if you said you want to annotate, I don't know, preaching poetry, then it might not work as well.
Yeah. Okay, so if someone wants to, I don't know, if someone wants to jump in and ask a question, please go ahead. I can't, tell who you are. Let me. This is where it would be nice if if we were if I could see everyone, because then I would say, oh, you look like you have a question, but I can't do it. So.
If I could, hi, Chris Foster here. Can you hear me?
Hello. Yeah.
Hi, sorry. I can't unmute my my video for the moment. But maybe if I could just ask a very simple question here for someone who's not as technologically savvy. The role of those two initial assumptions that you built in to initially train the annotator, rhyming on every even line and that all words rhyme with one another. Can you maybe just explain a little bit more why you picked those, why it's necessary to have those, and why not other options? So why not just say every word rhymes with every word and start with the, everything rhymes with everything everywhere, and then let it sort of work it out on its own?
Yeah,
just something that I was curious about, and I'm sure.
Yeah, that's a very good question because the entire work is based on this. So the two assumptions, they work against each other in a way. So the assumption that everything in rhyming position rhymes in a poem introduces a lot of noise in your algorithm, right? Because we know it is not true. And the community detection algorithm, which goes from this and makes that, is able to sustain a certain amount of noise and say, right, I have seen contact between this character and that character, but not often enough to be sure that they rhyme together, right? So it's the fact that we have enough matter for which the assumption is correct. So in other words, the noise is limited. That makes the community detection still work. So that's the second simplifying assumption. If I had taken every single character to be potentially rhyming, it would have generated so much noise. You would have said, oh, I think that every single character rhyme with each other. The noise would have drowned the signal. Because if we look at, let's take any poem, you see here we have 10 characters in rhyming position, and we are creating a graph with these 10. Now, if we said we're going to take these something like 100 characters and we said they all rhyme together, they would, all of this signal that is correct here, that is to say, yeah, indeed, in some poems, all the characters rhyme, and we said, actually, everything rhymes in this poem, it would have completely drowned the signal. I don't know. Is my explanation any clear, Chris?
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. So basically what you did was, as a shortcut, you took a non-arbitrary judgment in the sense that, okay, commonly we see every other line rhyming. So if we start with that, very simple assumption, that can help us sort through the noise in a way, give us a foothold into it.
Yeah, that's a way to say that's the smallest part of expert knowledge that you can bring. I don't even know if you can call it expert knowledge, but specialist knowledge, let's say.
So that being the smallest sort of assumption of, you know, expert knowledge. Have you then also brought in, so annotations that have been done by other scholars of poems, individual poems, taken that and used that to help the annotator sort of refine its learning, or does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. So this is a possibility. This is not something I've explored, but here, these two assumptions, they let me start with non-annotated text. You can also train, and this is what Mattis List does in his research on Old Chinese, is he says, let's take the annotation from, I believe, Baxter on the Book of Odes, and put it into, build a graph from these annotations, look at what the communities look like, and then comment on, so I believe he comments on the existence of a new type of rhyme that was not reconstructed before. So yes, you can use annotated corpus, and you could do anywhere in between. So you could say, I'm going to start from no annotation and annotate the corpus, and then review some of the poems and you know, fix the annotations and then retrain these kind of things. So
yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking of, you know, List's work. And then just curious if you've gone ahead and done that already with your annotator, and if you've seen any sort of changes, you know, significant changes.
I guess it would behave better, and maybe for non-shi poetry, then you would have to do that, maybe even bootstrap. And I think I kind of allude to it here when I say manually annotated corpora are set annotators already. And it's kind of what Mattis List does, is he says, right, it's already annotated, but can we apply community detection on top to kind of refine this annotation?
If I may just say, so you know, Julie and I have talked about this sort of stuff before a lot, and one thing that I find a clear way of thinking is that one of these assumptions, one of these simplifying assumptions, introduces false positives, which is that everything in rhyme position rhymes. That introduces false positives, whereas the assumption that only things on even lines rhyme introduces false negatives. And so that's what he means in terms of the assumptions kind of pushing in different directions. So it's a way of saying, like, well, you know, then we get rid of some of the signal and we get rid of some of the noise, and hopefully we're getting rid of more noise than signal, and that way the community detection algorithm actually finds the communities, and it seems to work. So, you know, there you go, right?
Yeah, and you could train on even numbered lines, but then annotate on all the lines, for instance. You know, that's totally possible. And here I didn't try to annotate every character in the poem. You know, like I said, I will not try to annotate the first line of a quatrain, but it is possible to do. It's just not something that I tried to do because my interest was more in the detection of phonological change than in the production of a corpus. But yeah, that's an avenue that can be followed.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you for clarifying. And also, I just think it's interesting. I know the focus here is on phonology, but I think you could almost retool this just slightly and bring in paleography as well. I can imagine sort of, you know, that sliding sort of approach that you use in terms of chronology, but also, you know, space, maybe being used to say, okay, different sort of orthographies of characters and how they match pronunciations of different periods and so forth. But
yeah, that would be super interesting. And I liked the fact that, you know, there was this example where we see all the characters that have the same graphical components being just at this border. Not making a claim on this, but yeah, this brings us back to graphical, well, sound components maybe being a good indication of a family of characters.
My thought is a way of testing sort of feasibility of orthographic variants in a poem based on sort of what we understand of the chronology and yeah, geography of its composition. So yeah.
Okay, well, are there any other people who might have a question? Please don't be shy, you know, if you do. But otherwise, it's actually we're right up against the time anyhow, so maybe it's it's good if you don't have a question as well. Let's see. Yes. So you also have Julian's contact information if you have a question. If you're interested in this sort of work, you're also welcome to get in touch with me. What to say? Thank you for Julien for giving this very interesting talk, and I think we all will look forward to the published version as one of the as Yen in the chat also says. Yes, so let me say, I don't know what to do in this world. A round of applause, or you can, make some little emojis or something. Yeah, okay, for Julien. And then I don't know, I'll see you at another talk sometime. Thank you all for joining us.